Welcome back to Kamikaze Overdrive MMA predictions to the Ultimate Fighter 13 finale. Now, UFC 130 hasn't taken place yet, so nothing to report there. The finale will take place on June 4th, 2011 at the Palms Casino Resort in Las Vegas, Nevada. There are currently 3 fights set up for the main card, which I'll be doing predictions for, along with the finals of the tournament. I'll also be providing my predictions of the semifinal fights that will air on the final night of the Ultimate Fighter. I know these fights have already taken place, but I don't know how they play out. And just like any other live fight, so let's just go with it. And now it's time for my first set of predictions. For the Ultimate Fighter 13 semifinals, we have Tony Ferguson taking on wildcard Chuck O'Neal and underdog Chris Cope squaring off with Ramsey Najim. Looking at Tony and Chuck first, these guys have a number of fights under their belts to date. Ferguson is 10-2, while O'Neal 8-3, so experience won't be an issue for either guy. The first thing I'm going to look at is the fatigue issue. Chuck has fought an extra fight in the more grueling of the two, so that could be a significant concern. Tony has ended his 2 fights inside the first round, while Chuck has gone into the second twice, along with a first-round submission defeat. Now, clearly coming off the last episode of the show, there is some significant animosity for this matchup as a result of Tony's actions in the house. Now, looking at where their best chance to win this fight are, Ferguson has 6 TKO victories against 5 submission wins for O'Neal. Chuck does have a submission win on the show, and Tony has 2 knockouts. But for me, I think that Chuck has been getting drawn into striking battles and away from his submission skills, and I would expect that this could happen in this fight. I like Chuck's toughness, but Tony has solid power in his hands, and he's a 2-time All-American wrestler, so if he wants, he should be able to take Chuck down and control him. So my prediction is Tony Ferguson to defeat Chuck O'Neal by stoppage. In the second semifinal, Chris Cope will square off with Ramsey Najim. Cope has upset his way into the semifinals while Ramsey has submitted both of his tournament opponents. Cope showed good takedown defense against Shamar Bailey, but a potential injury could have impacted Bailey's performance in that fight. For me, Ramsey has gone out and taken his victories with his wrestling and submission skills, while Cope has advanced with 2 decision wins that can partially be attributed to his opponents not performing up to their potential. I don't want to take too much credit away from Cope, but I really don't see him being able to offer too much for Ramsey in this fight. Look for Stripper Ramsey to come out and put Cope on his back, and I'm going to stick with the trend and take Ramsey to defeat Chris Cope by submission. If my predictions of the semifinals hold true, the Ultimate Fighter finals will be Tony Ferguson battling Ramsey Najim. Breaking the fight down, the experience edge is with Ferguson with 12 fights to Ramsey's 5. Physically, Ferguson will have a slight reach advantage and height advantage, the reach playing probably the bigger role. So far, Ramsey has used his wrestling to dominate his opponents, but in Tony, he will be facing a 2-time All-American and a National Wrestling Champion. Ramsey wrestled collegiately, but didn't procure the accolades that Ferguson did. I will be curious to see how these guys match up in the wrestling department. Now, I would think that Tony will have a slight edge on the mat, but I think that Ferguson might be wise to use his wrestling in reverse to keep the fight standing, as from what I have seen on the show and in each of their fights prior to the show, Tony's striking is superior. Tony scored the knockout in his last bout, and I've seen a number of his previous fights where he landed some pretty impressive striking combinations, including a powerful uppercut that had his opponent in a lot of trouble. Having watched almost all of Ramsey's career fight footage, I've seen little of his striking. But what I have seen is wild striking that usually results in a clinch and eventual takedown. The big issue with wrestlers that are just starting out in MMA, as we have seen with Brock Lesnar, is that they aren't used to getting punched in the face, and from what I've seen, Ramsey may very well fall into this category. So for this fight, my prediction is Tony Ferguson to defeat Ramsey by stoppage and become the newest Ultimate Fighter. Now, should one or both of my semifinal predictions be wrong, here are my picks for the other potential final combinations. I'd be taking Ramsey to defeat Chuck O'Neal by submission, Tony to defeat Chris Cope by stoppage, or Chuck to defeat Chris Cope by stoppage. So we'll have to see how things play out on the Ultimate Fighter coming up this week and see if my predictions come true. Now, the last time I attempted this, I was able and lucky enough to get both semifinals correct and the finals correct. We'll see if that plays out this time. In the UFC's middleweight division, 17-7 Edge Short Fuse Herman will take on 13-5 Crazy Tim Crater. Herman has only 1 win in his last 4 fights, and Crater's returning off a defeat to Nate Quarry. I'm going to call this fight a pick'em for betting purposes at $1.65 each. Now, these 2 fighters will be stepping into the cage for the first time in roughly 2 years, and both have suffered through some significant injuries. It is hard to judge how much of an effect this will have on each guy. Further, I'm wondering what they have added to their arsenals in the 20-plus months they've been away. But since it's so hard to evaluate the unknown, let's focus on what we do know. Having rewatched their past fights, I see a lot of similarities. They both possess improving but still rough striking skills that they have given opponents problems with in the past. Herman took out Joe Dorkson with an impressive knockout, catching with a left hand, and even though he suffered the loss, Crater had a lot of success with his striking against Nate Quarry. On the feet, it is hard to call who has the better striking. I do like Crater's ability to take punishment and keep coming forward, and against Quarry he got dropped a couple of times, but was able to get back to his feet and kept attacking. For Herman, he had some difficulty with Aaron Simpson's striking as Simpson came forward aggressively and had short fuse backpedaling. So in the striking department, I would expect it's simply going to break down into a brawl. Now, where both of these guys are a little rough around the edges standing, when the fight hits the mat, they are both quite capable. Crater is a BJJ black belt with 8 career submissions, and Herman has a wrestling background fighting out of Team Quest, and he holds 12 tap OWs. The best aspect of Tim's ground game is his ability to slap on submissions quickly. Against Nick Catone, Tim used an offensive guard to attack Catone, continually lock in submissions, and eventually seal the deal with a guillotine. Herman showed himself to be vulnerable to flash submissions as Dorkston lost in a triangle almost out of nowhere that would have finished the fight had the round not expired, so Herman will need to be very wary of how aggressive Tim is off his back. On the other side of things, I really like Herman's takedown skills. He keeps it simple yet effective. Most often he will look to connect his hands with a body lock and use a trip to complete the takedown. He has been able to land over 50% of his attempts, scoring 5 each against David Loazo and Alan Belcher. His top control is solid, and if Nate Quarry was able to control Crater on the mat with his ground and pound, Herman should be able to as well. Nick Catone was able to take Crater down at will, but I feel Catone's lack of experience heading into that bout was the main reason he got caught in the submission. Now, the combination of Herman's ground skills and wrestling should prevent this, and Ed has defeated talented submission fighters before in the past in Nick Thompson, Joe Dorkston, and Dave Monet, who have combined for 72 submission wins of their own. Finally, returning to the issue of the layoff, both fighters could have problems with conditioning. If that is the case, I would much rather take the fighter that has the superior wrestling skills and is most likely to be on top. For me, that's Herman, as he's got 23 takedowns in the UFC compared to Crater's 1. Tim will be forced to carry Herman's weight for the majority of the fight, which will take its toll and wear on him. It won't be pretty, but I have Ed Herman grinding out a decision victory over Tim Crater. In the UFC light heavyweight division, 10-2 Kyle King Boo Kingsbury will meet Fabio Maldonado 18-3. Kingsbury has won 3 in a row, and the Brazilian has won an impressive 11 in a row, including his UFC debut. On the books, the fight could be tight. I'll give Maldonado the favorite status at $1.60, and Kingsbury has a slight dog at $1.95. Now, taking a look first at Maldonado, the guy is a veteran of 21 fights, so even though he is still new to the UFC, he has a lot of experience. Maldonado's best attributes are his hands. He has solid boxing skills, which he demonstrated in his debut against James McSweeney. Now, in that fight, and also against one-time UFC fighter Mikhail Falco, Fabio seemed to struggle early with both fighters' aggressive attacks, but to his credit was able to weather the storm and rebounded, scoring knockouts. The Brazilian has some solid combinations, for the most part, not throwing a great deal of kicks, and he changes levels quite nicely. In fact, it was a nasty body shot that changed the flow of his match with McSweeney. After scoring with a body blow, the Brit noticeably was slowed down, and Fabio began to open up and eventually put McSweeney away with an overwhelming barrage. Further on, Fabio demonstrated a solid chin in that fight as he got tagged several times and continued to walk forward. On the negative side, his ground game is probably his biggest issue. At one point in his last fight, he passed a side control and appeared to be on his way to a dominant position before he inadvertently put himself back in half and eventually full guard. To further cement the concern for his ground game, his trainer Ed Soares has even publicly stated that Maldonado's biggest problems occur when his opponent puts him on his back. Now, his opponent, Kyle Kingsbury, is still developing his skills, but one thing is certain, he's more than capable of scoring a takedown in this fight. In fact, in his last outing against Jared Hammond, he was able to complete 9 takedowns. And even though he wasn't able to keep his opponent on the mat, Kyle's ability to finish his attempts should be a concern for Fabio. Kingsbury is an aggressive fighter. He has big power and uses a lot of straight punches that did a lot of damage in his last victory. Kyle will push a tremendous pace, but the knock on him, at least so far, is his inability to maintain that work rate. Against Hammond, he found himself in a real slugfest that took its toll and resulted in a significant drop-off in performance in the later stages of the fight. Now, I believe that the physical attributes of this matchup could end up playing a decisive role in the outcome. Kingsbury is going to have a significant height and reach advantage, standing 3 inches taller with a 4-inch reach advantage. Now, McSweeney's reach and aggressive style really gave the Brazilian problems in the first round as he was unable to get inside. Fabio has the better technical boxing skills, but if he isn't able to get in range of the much bigger opponent, the effectiveness of those skills will be limited. Kingsbury will need to avoid falling into the same trap as past opponents who have come out very aggressively and quickly faded and were subsequently picked apart. The difference maker in this matchup will be Kingsbury's takedowns. If he's able to exploit Maldonado's shortcomings on the mat, he could very well earn a victory on this night. So my prediction is Kyle Kingsbury to defeat Fabio Maldonado by stoppage. In the main event of the evening, lightweights Clay the Carpenter Guida 28-8 and the last WEC lightweight champion Anthony Showtime Pettis 11-1 will go to war. Guida is in search of his 4th consecutive victory, while Pettis is looking for his 5th straight win. On the books, Pettis will be the betting favorite at $1.50 and Guida the dog at $2.20. For both of these guys, this fight will greatly impact their positions in the division. Pettis was granted a shot at the champ after winning the WEC title, but should he drop this bout, he could potentially lose that opportunity. For Clay Guida, he has been battling in the division since 2006 and is riding his second 3-fight winning streak in the UFC. The first time he began to build some title momentum, he dropped his next 2 bouts to top contenders Diego Sanchez and Kenny Florian. He will need to avoid a similar drop-off here. Looking at this bout, Guida is a relentless brawler with wrestling skills to fall back on, while Anthony Pettis is an incredibly creative striker that out of necessity has been working to improve his wrestling skills. Revisiting a number of Pettis' recent fights, it would appear that his opponents have attempted to use their takedowns to control Anthony. UFC.com has his takedown defense at a respectable 71%, but in 6 WEC fights he's been taken down at least 1 time, and with Guida's wrestling background I would expect he will enter this bout with a similar approach. Guida has scored submission wins in his last 3 bouts and over a 15-fight stretch has attempted 103 takedowns, completing 40%. These stats suggest that we should see Pettis on his back or at least several takedown attempts by Clay. For Pettis, his defensive skills have multiple layers. He has good takedown defense and will use his timing to punish an opponent when they shoot. Further, he is an excellent scrambler and demonstrated this multiple times against a top-level wrestler in Shane Roller. Roller was able to get Pettis off of his feet, but Anthony was able to scramble to a better position. Also in that tilt, Pettis executed a push off the cage, reversing from full mount to his own advantageous position. Finally, he is quite adept at throwing up his legs and attempting to catch a triangle, which he was able to do, finally finishing Roller. Guida will need to deal with all of this in order to control Pettis on the mat. If he is not able to do this and the fight remains standing, the advantage shifts to the WEC champ. Pettis is a dynamic striker which is highlighted by his kicking arsenal. He throws a large array of leg strikes that come from all sorts of angles and can really keep his opponent off balance. Combining his kicks with a set of solid hands, Showtime striking is his key to victory, but Guida will offer Anthony an interesting look when they do exchange. In his last bout, Guida used an excessive amount of head movement to keep Takanori Gomi from landing his power strikes, and I would expect he will use a similar style here in an attempt to disrupt his opponent's rhythm. On the offensive, Clay did a lot of swinging and missing, most often with a wild right hand. I attribute this to Gomi's slight 2-inch reach advantage. This could be a problem for Clay against Pettis, as Showtime is going to have a 4-inch reach advantage, and where Gomi used next to no kicks, I expect Pettis will create even a greater distance with his plethora of leg strikes. The Carpenter is also well known for his relentless pace that overwhelms and frustrates his opponents, but if Clay is unable to close the distance and get inside against Anthony, this could be a moot point. Clay's best offensive striking is a combination kick-punch, where he forces his opponent to defend the kick and leave an opening for Clay to slip in a punch. He also had good success against Gomi when he would set up his takedown with a quick strike shot combination. My expectations are that Clay is going to really struggle to find success throughout the bout. Pettis has multiple ways of defending takedown attempts or recovering should he be put on his back. On the feet, the reach and superior striking abilities of the WEC vet will win out. Clay has never been knocked out, but he has been submitted on 7 occasions. I see a lot of opportunities for Anthony Pettis' submission, either off his back or by rocking Clay and following it up to the mat. So my prediction is Anthony Pettis to defeat Clay Guida by submission. Welcome back to Kamikaze Countdown. There's 3 things I want to touch upon for this edition. The first being the eye injury suffered by Zach on The Ultimate Fighter. I believe it was Zach. He has suffered 2 torn retinas, I believe it is, and that takes me back to George St. Pierre. I know I've touched upon this several times. I'm going to leave it alone after this, but it really shows you how significant that injury was, as George definitely had to be passing through his mind that the injury could be career-ending, because when you can't see, clearly you can't continue fighting. So it shows how much of an impact that had on his performance, but I'm going to leave it alone at that. Secondly, it's been talked about GSP versus Diaz. It's been talked about fighting in Montreal. I'd actually like to see George go outside of his home nation. I'm from Canada. I want to see George fight, let's say Madison Square Garden, if New York gets things all fired up correctly. I like to see George, not have the home crowd on his side every night time he fights. Should be interesting. And finally, another big fight that has been announced. I believe it's going to take place in the Versus event this summer, and it really, drives me insane now. Jim Miller taking on Ben Henderson. I'm 0-3 picking Jim Miller fights. I'm 0-2 picking Ben Henderson fights. Both guys have given me trouble in the past, but now in my last prediction, I said I couldn't pick against Jim Miller no matter what the situation is. But Ben Henderson's last performance against Mark Bocek really has me wondering what to do in that fight. So we will see how it plays out, and thanks for listening to the Kamikaze Countdown. So those are my predictions, 6 fights in all, including the 2 Ultimate Fighter semifinal matchups, and we'll see how things turn out, hopefully for the better. The events are really starting to pick up as we have UFC 131 in Vancouver next, and that'll be followed closely behind by Strikeforce's, the next installment of Strikeforce's heavyweight tournament. And as always, thank you very much for watching. That's all for me, and I will see you back here in a very short period of time. Good luck this weekend with UFC 130. It should be a fantastic card.